Personal. It's more about fun. I'm having a blast. I mean, this is a great job. I love to compete. I love the training, learning, getting better, learning new skills.
At 62 years old, Randy Couture should be celebrated as one of the most influential fighters in MMA history, a multiple-time UFC champion, a pioneer who defied age and weight class, and the first true cerebral brawler in the sport. But today, he's almost a ghost in the very organization he helped build. Despite his legendary status, Randy's name is rarely mentioned on UFC broadcasts. There are no tribute videos, no Hall of Fame ceremonies with fanfare, and no coaching roles offered. Why? Because behind the scenes, Dana White made sure Couture's legacy wouldn't shine the way it should. And now, with reports of mounting health issues, financial stress, and public silence, fans are starting to realize something chilling. Randy Couture's legacy is being buried alive. This is the tragic story of how a true warrior became invisible. Before the world of MMA had pay-per-view superstars, trash-talking champions, and billion-dollar TV deals, there was Randy Couture, a man who embodied discipline, respect, and raw resilience. Born in 1963, Couture didn't follow the typical trajectory of young fighters. Instead, he served in the U.S. Army, then became an All-American wrestler at Oklahoma State. At a time when most athletes were retiring, Randy was just getting started. He entered the UFC in 1997, already 34 years old. In a sport dominated by younger, wilder men, Couture was seen as too old to make a splash. He didn't just prove people wrong, he dismantled expectations. In only his fourth professional fight, he captured the UFC Heavyweight Championship, defeating Maurice Smith. It wasn't just a victory. It was a statement. Age is nothing if you have heart and skill. Fans dubbed him Captain America for good reason. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a soldier, the technical brilliance of a tactician, and the stoicism of a man who knew war in more ways than one. His wrestling style wasn't flashy, but it was suffocating. His clinch work against the fence was legendary, and more than anything, he was respected. As the UFC grew, Couture became one of its most recognizable faces. He headlined cards, coached on The Ultimate Fighter, and represented the sport with dignity. While others relied on hype or antics, Randy relied on grit. But behind that composed exterior, something was brewing. As the UFC morphed from a raw combat spectacle into a corporate machine, Couture's values clashed with the direction of the company. He wasn't just fighting opponents anymore, he was beginning to push back against the system itself. While most fighters burn out or fade when they hit their late 30s, Randy Couture decided to reinvent himself. In 2003, he shocked the MMA world by dropping down to the light heavyweight division at the age of 40. Something nearly unheard of. Critics assumed the weight cut would sap his strength. They assumed younger fighters like Chuck Liddell would walk through him. But Couture had different plans. In one of the most iconic moments in UFC history, he dominated Chuck Liddell with relentless pressure, dirty boxing, and wrestling. Then, not long after, he took on Tito Ortiz, the biggest villain in MMA at the time, and humiliated him over 5 rounds. Fans erupted. Couture wasn't just competing with younger stars, he was outthinking them, outworking them, and beating them. At this point, he became the first fighter in UFC history to win titles in 2 different weight classes. Dana White himself admitted, "Randy is a freak of nature. The guy's a legend." But as Couture's stock rose, so did the tension between him and UFC brass. He was asking for better pay, asking for more transparency, and asking questions that Dana White didn't want asked. This made Randy a problem. A respectful one, but still a thorn in the side of the UFC's corporate model. Still, he soldiered on. He coached on The Ultimate Fighter, bringing strategy and mentorship to a sport that had long been fueled by rage and ego. He became a father figure in the gym and a hero to older fans who saw themselves in him. His intelligence set him apart, but it also made him dangerous, not in the cage, but in the boardroom. As he climbed to legendary status, Dana White's attitude began to change. Once praised publicly, Couture was now being framed as difficult, demanding, and over the hill. And that shift would only get worse. The fallout between Dana White and Randy Couture wasn't loud at first, but it was cold and calculated. Behind the scenes, Couture was pushing for things UFC didn't want to give: better contracts, more fighter freedom, and fair revenue sharing. At a time when UFC fighters were still being grossly underpaid, Couture was one of the few brave enough to speak out, and that made him dangerous to the UFC's growing empire. In 2007, Couture stunned the MMA world. While still the UFC heavyweight champion, he walked away from the promotion. In a now infamous letter of resignation, he cited disrespect and being lied to as key reasons. He claimed that he was promised a fight with Fedor Emelianenko, the world's best heavyweight, and was being kept from it for political and financial reasons. Dana White, furious, fired back publicly. He called Randy disloyal and dishonest. And even though Randy's fans believed him, even admired his stand, the UFC began rewriting the narrative. That's when the media blackout began. During major UFC events, Couture's past fights were no longer highlighted. His name was barely mentioned in promotional materials. Younger fans tuning in wouldn't even know who he was. His accolades, which once stood at the top of the UFC's historical rankings, were being quietly buried. Dana White held grudges. That was nothing new. But with Couture, it became personal. Randy had challenged the structure. He'd dared to shine a light on the backroom dealings of an empire that thrived on silence. Despite eventually returning for a few more fights, Couture would never fully regain his place in UFC's inner circle. He was out, not because he lost, but because he spoke the truth. And for that, Dana White made sure he paid the price, not with his fists, but with his legacy. If there was ever a match that symbolized legacy, respect, and global stakes, it was Randy Couture versus Fedor Emelianenko. For years, fans dreamed of the clash. Fedor was the silent Russian killer from Pride, undefeated and unstoppable. Couture was the thinking man's fighter, a legend in both heavyweight and light heavyweight classes. It wasn't about money, it was about history. But Dana White saw it differently. In 2007, Couture walked out of the UFC after failed negotiations for the Fedor fight. Despite being under contract, he resigned as champion. He believed he had fulfilled his obligations. Dana White disagreed. What followed was a legal and public war. The UFC filed injunctions, froze contracts, and made it impossible for Couture to fight outside the organization. Randy tried to sign with Affliction, the only promotion at the time willing to host the Fedor bout, but the UFC shut it down at every turn. For nearly 15 months, Couture sat in limbo, wasting prime years of his career while the UFC used its legal muscle to keep him grounded. Fans and pundits were vocal. This wasn't about contracts anymore, it was about control. Dana White couldn't risk his champion leaving and losing on another platform. It would undermine the illusion that the UFC was the world's only elite proving ground. And Couture, by walking out, had challenged that illusion. What hurt most was that Randy wanted the fight for all the right reasons. He knew he was near the end of his run. He wanted to face the best before he retired. But corporate walls blocked the final chapter of his dream. When Couture finally returned in 2008, the Fedor fight was dead. Emelianenko signed with other organizations. The UFC had won, not in the octagon, but in court. And what should have been Randy's crowning moment became a silent reminder of how even legends can be chained. When Randy Couture returned to the UFC in 2008, he was 45 years old. Most fighters his age were long gone, but Randy came back to face Brock Lesnar, the freakishly athletic former WWE star who was newer to MMA but carried size, speed, and marketing appeal. Couture held his own until he didn't. Lesnar landed a brutal right hand and finished him. Just like that, the belt was gone. But even in loss, Randy never lost his dignity. He returned again to fight Antonio, Rodrigo Nogueira, James Toney, and Lyoto Machida. Each of these fights told a different story, one of age, pride, and inevitability. Against Machida, Couture was knocked out by a front kick to the face. Fans watched in horror as their hero lay flat, motionless. In that moment, it was clear. The era of Randy Couture was truly over. But what came next was even more disturbing. There was no major farewell event, no Dana White interview praising his legacy, no retrospective video packages. Unlike Chuck Liddell or Matt Hughes, Randy was not given the full legend treatment. Why? Because his exit wasn't clean. He had challenged the system, and Dana White never forgot that. Instead of celebrating one of the greatest fighters in history, the UFC allowed Couture to fade quietly. They didn't bring him back as a commentator. He wasn't offered a coaching spot on The Ultimate Fighter again. He was treated like a man who had never existed. Randy opened his gym, Xtreme Couture, and continued to coach fighters. But his relationship with the UFC remained frozen. No appearances at major events. No commentary work. No acknowledgement of the doors he opened. And it hurt. Fans noticed. Fighters noticed. But the company line was clear. Randy Couture was no longer welcome. And unlike others who had fallen out of favor and later reconciled, Randy's punishment seemed permanent. Today, Randy Couture is 62 years old. He still trains, he still coaches, but beneath the surface, his body is breaking down. Years of combat, in wrestling, in the cage, in military training, have left scars that don't show on highlight reels. In October 2019, Couture suffered a heart attack while working out. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. In typical Randy fashion, he quietly walked himself to the hospital. Doctors were stunned. Any other person might not have made it, but Randy pushed through. That's who he is. Since then, he's kept most of his health private, but those close to him say he suffers from chronic pain, reduced mobility, and possible signs of cognitive wear. Years of head trauma, especially during early UFC days when gloves were thinner and referees slower, have taken their toll. And unlike fighters tied into UFC's internal ecosystem, Couture doesn't have the same medical or financial safety nets. He's outside the fold. He didn't benefit from the recent expansions in retirement support or Legends outreach programs. He's on his own. His acting career, which once showed promise in films like The Expendables, has also dried up. Hollywood moved on. UFC moved on. And Randy is left in a strange no-man's land, too iconic to forget, but too controversial for the UFC to embrace. He appears occasionally at non-UFC events. He gives back to veteran programs, but there's a heaviness in his voice now, a sadness, a sense of someone who did everything right and still got left behind. Randy Couture didn't retire with a parade. He didn't receive a golden handshake. He wasn't invited to be part of the UFC's growing pantheon of brand ambassadors. He was quietly, systematically erased. Unlike Chuck Liddell or Forrest Griffin, who were awarded behind-the-scenes roles and honored at Hall of Fame events, Couture became a ghost in the very house he helped build. Fans started noticing that during highlight reels or anniversary celebrations, Randy's name was either omitted or barely mentioned. And it wasn't an accident. Dana White, the man who once praised Couture as the face of the UFC, now refused to utter his name in interviews. The tension between them wasn't just personal. It became policy. Couture's split from the UFC, his public demand for better fighter treatment, and his willingness to question the machine had cost him his seat at the table. This blacklisting extended to his business ventures. When Couture joined Via Combat Bellator MMA as a commentator and face of the brand, the UFC viewed it as an act of war. Dana White declared Randy banned from UFC events, even if his son Ryan Couture was fighting on the card. That's right, When Ryan made his UFC debut in 2013, Randy was not allowed to corner his own son. That wasn't just petty, it was personal punishment. White told the media, "Randy's not a good guy. He's not who you think he is." No elaboration. No explanation. Just vague bitterness. The organization that once profited off Randy's legacy now distanced itself entirely. Even years later, as Dana patched up relationships with Tito Ortiz and even Ken Shamrock, the ban on Randy Couture never lifted. He remains the only UFC Hall of Famer to be unofficially blacklisted from UFC programming. The man who once wore 2 belts, filled arenas, and fought legends became an unperson in the sport he helped legitimize. And unlike others, Couture's erasure wasn't due to scandal or criminal behavior. It was due to something far more threatening in the UFC's eyes: integrity. For someone once known as Captain America, Randy Couture's later years have been defined by quiet isolation. While he still owns and operates Xtreme Couture, a reputable gym in Las Vegas, his public presence has largely faded. The UFC's refusal to acknowledge him cast a long shadow. He doesn't attend UFC fan expos. He's not featured on Fight Pass documentaries. He's not invited to commentary desks or legend panels. For many new fans, Couture might as well be a name in a record book. No context, no tribute, no legacy. Even the UFC Hall of Fame induction, which happened back in 2006, now feels hollow. There's no ceremony, no event footage, no updated recognition, and when the UFC inducted newer stars like Khabib Nurmagomedov or Michael Bisping, they were honored in ways Couture never received. This absence bleeds into his fan base, too. While older fans still revere him, many younger viewers have never watched him fight. They've seen GSP, they've seen McGregor, but they've never seen Couture dominate with dirty boxing against the cage or grind down an opponent with Olympic-level clinch work. Even in coaching circles, Couture is often overlooked in favor of more marketable names. Despite having a mind for strategy and one of the highest fight IQs in MMA history, few major fighters today openly cite Randy as an influence. Not because he wasn't great, but because his name isn't passed down like the others. It's a strange kind of tragedy, to build something and then be excluded from it, and it's left Couture in a quiet position. He continues to coach out of loyalty and passion. He supports military charities and runs his foundation, but behind the professionalism, there's a loneliness. There are no book deals, no major documentaries, no biopics in the works. Despite being one of the sport's founding fathers, Couture walks through life largely uncelebrated. For a man who spent his life fighting for others, for teammates, for fans, for fellow fighters, the world now offers only silence in return. And yet, despite it all, Randy Couture is still standing. He may be in pain, he may be blacklisted, but his impact remains. Ask any true student of MMA. They'll tell you that without Randy Couture, the UFC wouldn't be what it is today. He proved that wrestlers could thrive in MMA. He proved that age doesn't define greatness. He proved that you can win with class, lose with honor, and fight with purpose. He wasn't just a fighter, he was a standard bearer. Couture's influence lives on through gyms like Xtreme Couture. His charity work for veterans and first responders continues. He hosts grappling clinics, teaches seminars, and gives back in ways that don't make headlines, but change lives. And perhaps, in that quiet rebellion, Randy has found peace. The UFC may not acknowledge him. Dana White may continue his silent vendetta. But the story of MMA will always include Randy Couture, because you can't erase the man who built the foundation. Still, it's hard not to view his life at 62 as tragic. A man who sacrificed everything, his health, his family time, his fame, is now sidelined in the world he helped legitimize. There are no teary interviews, no farewell tour, no Hall of Fame send-off. Just a warrior quietly living with the scars of battle, and the knowledge that, In the end, doing the right thing often comes at the highest cost. They buried the man, but they couldn't kill the legend. There's a reason why Randy Couture's name still floats around quietly in forums, whispered reverently among old-school fans who were there when the UFC was underground, bloody and real. It's because he wasn't just a fighter, he was the blueprint. Before the era of viral knockouts and trash talkers engineered for the spotlight, Couture brought something rare to the octagon: discipline, humility, and relentless evolution. He was a thinking fighter, a strategist, a leader. When the sport had no rules, no weight classes, and no real money, Randy Couture stepped into the cage not for fame, but to test the limits of what a man could endure and overcome. So to see him now, at 62, living with a fractured relationship to the very sport he helped create, it's more than tragic. It's a quiet betrayal. The UFC's marketing machine loves to romanticize its pioneers, but not the ones who stood up to them. Not the ones who walked out when things weren't right. Not the ones who couldn't be controlled. That's the real reason Couture was sidelined. It wasn't about contracts or commentary gigs. It was about precedent. If Randy could leave, speak his mind, join a rival promotion, and still be loved by fans, what would that say to other fighters? That loyalty to the UFC wasn't everything? That they had options? That they could fight for better treatment? That was the threat Couture posed. And for that, he was buried alive in the sports history books. Yet here's what they can't erase: the 40-year-old who shocked the world by reclaiming the heavyweight title, the father figure who mentored younger fighters while still competing, the tactician who brought Greco-Roman wrestling into dominance in the cage, the icon who carried the sport through eras of obscurity and into the light. Even now, walking slower and speaking softer, Randy Couture still lives by a warrior's code. He shows up, he trains, he teaches. His name may not trend anymore, but in the deepest layers of MMA's soul, where grit and honor still matter, his story is immortal. Because Randy didn't just fight opponents, he fought for fighters. And that legacy, no matter how hard they try to bury it, will never die.